Okay, I'd like to thank everyone for coming to our 5th annual conference on sustainability. Our next speaker is actually brought to us with generous support from Dr. David Sunseri. UNA is privileged to have the endowed Sunseri Speaker Series, which was established in 2016 with the College of Arts and Sciences. Sunseri is a 1998 chemistry grad with a PhD in chemistry from Florida State. The series was established in memory of Jennifer Lee Sunseri, focuses on the integration of arts and creativity with the science to drive innovation. Our speaker today for the Sunseri series is Ms. Alice Evans. She's the director of the Alabama Sustainable Agricultural Network. The ASAN is a grassroots organization of farmers, consumers, and agriculture-related organizations, all committed to promoting sustainable agriculture in Alabama. So please welcome Ms. Evans. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to put this. Good morning. Can y'all hear me okay? Okay, great. Thank you so much for having me. Thank you, Dr. Webb, and to Dr. Burkholder and the whole conference planning team. It is a privilege to be here speaking with y'all today, and I'm thrilled to be part of such a wonderful event. My name is Alice Evans, and I'm the Executive Director of the Alabama Sustainable Agriculture Network, or ASAN for short. And I want to talk today about why we must shift focus from a production line to a relationship web if we are to build a sustainable agricultural system. ASAN is a grassroots network of small-scale sustainable farmers in Alabama, as well as other folks from throughout the food system, so farmers market managers, gardeners, business owners, nonprofit folks, folks from Extension and the universities. I like to say that ASAN is made up of farmers and eaters and everybody in between. And we're a network that aims to provide resources and training and connectivity with the overall goal of building a resilient agricultural system in Alabama. Our mission is to deepen relationships between the people of Alabama, the food that we eat, and the place that we live. I want to spend some time talking with y'all today about why that's important and why it's connected to ASAN's vision of building a resilient agricultural system in Alabama. Cool, that worked. The famous naturalist John Muir is often quoted as saying, "When we try to pick out anything by itself, we find it hitched to everything else in the universe." When we try to pick out anything by itself, we find it hitched to everything else in the universe. I want y'all to hold that idea in your minds as we move through our time together today. Cool. It's nice when these work. So one of the basic, I jinxed myself. There we go. So one of the basic tenets of industrialism is this chain or line of production. You start with raw materials, combine them, process them, package them, transport them, consume them, and then dispose of the waste. It's a linear process. At no point does the end become the beginning again. Each turn of the crank digs us a little bit deeper into a rut. Now, contrast that to the idea of a sustainable cycle. The whole idea of something being sustainable is that it replaces what it takes. It can be sustained for as long as needed. It doesn't erode its own foundation, and it doesn't borrow from future productivity to maximize productivity now. The same is true for the idea of something being regenerative, except that in the case of regenerative, the process is actually leaving things better than when it started. When you get to spend a lot of time around agriculture nerds, the way I do, and the way some of y'all may, you get to hear people really wax poetic about soil. But once you learn a little about soil, you understand a little more about where they're coming from, and you start to see that they're right, to understand soil with awe and reverence. There's a saying that for all our lofty achievements, humankind owes our existence to a 6-inch layer of topsoil and the fact that it rains. And soil, or healthy soil at least, is much more than a substance. It's more of an organism unto itself. Healthy soil acts like a sponge for water and nutrients, and specifically, the part of the soil that makes a difference here is what's called soil organic matter. When agricultural systems focus on maximizing production instead of on the overall health of the soil, we see a reduction of soil organic matter. As a result of that, we see a reduction in the soil's overall ability to retain vital nutrients. So the sponge gets smaller in a way, or less spongy, maybe. As a result, conventional farmers must add more and more replacement nutrients simply to keep pace, all while a smaller and smaller percentage of those nutrients are actually being held on to, which means more and more of them are running off to eventually pollute waterways and ecosystems downstream. It's a downward spiral. One of the primary aims of sustainable agriculture is to avoid these downward spirals and instead seek to create closed or self-feeding loops. One simple reason for this is that it's more efficient. Industrialism has really claimed ownership over the word efficiency, with this idea that doing one thing repeatedly and at the largest scale possible is the most efficient way to do things. But really, it's only the most efficient way of doing that one thing. In the meantime, like the example with the soil organic matter, it's eroding all these natural cycles, eroding the foundation of holding everything together, and creating all of these externalities that then have to be dealt with in complicated and costly ways. When you can spend your energy nurturing a healthy soil ecosystem and building soil organic matter, and feeding the entire web of your farm's soil ecosystem, you get to benefit from natural cycles and natural relationships that ultimately make your job as a farmer much easier and much more successful. Healthy soil produces healthy plants, and healthy plants, in turn, have fewer pest and disease issues. Healthy farm ecosystems have built-in contingency plans, so even if you do develop a pest or a disease issue or a nutrient deficiency, you might have beneficial insects who move in to help manage the pests, or you might have a mycelial network, which is sort of like a fungal internet, in the soil, transporting and balancing nutrients from one part to another. In short, when you can see yourself as part of this larger ecological community, rather than the master of a production line, then you're able to tap into a whole lot of ecological magic, help from microbes and fungi and insects that aren't even part of the picture otherwise. This not only helps you to be a better farmer, but it's also just the right thing to do ecologically. So, some of y'all saw him outside. I have a 15-month-old baby. His name is Moss, and he's quite the bookworm. So in the past year or so, I've gotten the chance to learn a whole new body of fine literature that I had no knowledge of previously. We have this one book called The Little Blue Truck. It starts out with this little blue truck driving along these winding dirt roads in this beautiful pastoral landscape. There are tons of wildflowers and cattails and trees and birds perched in the trees, and there's farmland planted in crop rows, and a nice big red barn. The little blue truck is this sort of old-timey pickup with friendly-looking headlights for eyes. As the road winds through, the little blue truck beeps at different animals, and they say hey back. So it starts out, and you think it's just going to be this story about animal names and what sounds each animal makes. But then a little ways in, a new character shows up on the scene, the dump truck. Obviously the villain. The dump truck is full of gravel and has angry headlight eyes. The words, the actual typeface of the book, gets really big and bold and angry, and the dump comes careening through this nice, gentle, pastoral scene, sending everybody tumbling. The dump honks at the little blue truck and the animals and yells that he's got big, important things to do as he barrels through, saying he doesn't have time to pass the day with every duck along the way. That's the voice I use when I read it. So the dump truck gets points for being singularly focused on his goal, right? He's not a dilly-dallyer like the little blue truck. He's not wasting any time. He would say that he's being efficient. But then the dump truck goes around a curve and gets stuck in the mud. And he honks, but nobody comes to help him. Until the sweet little blue truck bumbles up, bless his heart. And he tries to push the dump out of the mud, but he ends up getting stuck himself. At this point, the little blue truck beeps for help, beep, 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 and all his friends come galloping and flapping up, one by one, to come to their friend's rescue. Every last one of the critters that the little blue truck beeped hello to, they all line up and push, head to head and rump to rump, and they get the trucks free. Yay! So the moral here, and I know this is pretty highbrow literature, so I'm going to spell it out for y'all, is that the little bit of attention paid to cultivating relationships creates the kind of cushion, the kind of abundance that you may be able to tell yourself in the moment that you don't need, but that you absolutely do need if any one tiny thing strays off course for you. And we all know that if something can go wrong, that it eventually will. So being resilient is precisely about cultivating that web of relationships that's going to work with you and take care of you because you, in turn, take care of it. Ultimately, all of our livelihoods trace back to the health of the soil, back to the health of the land and the health of the ecosystem. We are not separate from so-called nature. We're not separate from the environment. Because we eat and drink and breathe and exist in metabolic and chemical and energetic conversation with the world around us. We are all part of the agricultural system because we all eat. To quote Wendell Berry, who's one of my favorites, eating is an agricultural act. Eating ends the annual drama of the food economy that begins with planting and birth. Most eaters, however, are no longer aware that this is true. They think of food as an agricultural product, perhaps, but they do not think of themselves as participants in agriculture. They think of themselves as consumers. Most urban shoppers would tell you that food is produced on farms, but most of them do not know what farms, or what kinds of farms, or where the farms are, or what knowledge of skills are involved in farming. They apparently have little doubt that farms will continue to produce, but they do not know how or over what obstacles. For them, then, food is pretty much an abstract idea, something they do not know or imagine until it appears on the grocery shelf or on the table. Sorry, I keep having to bend down. So we've talked about how we must shift focus from the hyper-specialized, reductionist production line to instead focus on the relationship web if we want to create a resilient agricultural system. And thus far, we've talked about how we must do that in terms of the farm itself. We must shift focus in this way, not only on farms and not only as farmers, but in many ways and on many levels. In the context of farming, yes, but also in the context of how we think about and come together to form the food system, and how we think about and come together to form our culture or community more broadly, and how one generation of that culture succeeds the one before it through time. So first, in the context of how we come together to form a food system, most of us are not, in fact, farmers. Some of y'all may be, And some of y'all may have a garden, which is excellent, and definitely not something to be minimized or underappreciated. But like Wendell Berry says, most of us have outsourced our most direct and immediate intimacy with soil and land and ecology. Farmers are stewarding that relationship for us, in a way. They are the ones on the ground stewarding the process that turns light and water and soil into food, which in turn, when we eat it, literally becomes our bodies. That's a pretty big thing to entrust to someone or lots of someones that you otherwise have no knowledge of or intimacy with or shared cultural connection to. Industrial agriculture loves to talk about how one farmer can support X number of people, but maybe we've overshot the ratio in that regard. We're culturally and spiritually alienated from the land, from natural cycles and rhythms and processes, and it shows. So this idea of knowing your farmer isn't just some gimmicky effort for you to take on a fun new pet or a mascot or something. It's that it's better for farmers and for so-called consumers when there's some familiarity between the two. When the folks eating the food know something about the real day-to-day lived experience of the folks growing the food. And I don't just mean some idyllic, caricatured version of that experience, but the gritty, messy, complicated version. So, lots of us in elementary school learned about a guy named George Washington Carver. He's the guy who supposedly invented peanut butter and lots of other products made from peanuts and soybeans and sweet potatoes. But that's generally all we learn about him. At least, it's all I learned about him in school. It wasn't until I was in my 20s that I learned a more complete version of that story. Because see, in elementary school, you don't ever learn why he was so obsessed with inventing things made out of peanuts and soybeans and sweet potatoes. And it turns out the why is integral to the story as a whole. George Washington Carver was recruited to Tuskegee University by Booker T. Washington, who founded the school in 1881. This was less than 3 decades after emancipation and the end of the Civil War. And formerly enslaved African Americans in the South found themselves trying to eke out a livelihood as farmers and sharecroppers on land and on soil that was incredibly poor and depleted. Peanuts and soybeans, as you may know, are both legumes, meaning that they can take nitrogen from the air, where it's abundant, and fix it into a form that's usable by crops. So essentially, they can fertilize themselves. They can thrive, for that reason, even in poor soils, and they leave the soil actually better than they found it. But at that time, peanuts and soybeans weren't profitable cash crops. People didn't really eat them very much. So George Washington Carver went about experimenting and researching and developing all these new ways for them to be used, and essentially created markets for them. He made them into profitable cash crops and helped save the lives of countless black farmers in the process. The point here is that you could eat a jar of peanut butter and never know this whole story, but that if you want to build a resilient agricultural system, you have to know and understand the power that you have as the consumer, the so-called consumer, to drive the process from the bottom up. And you have to understand that in order to wield that power effectively, in a way that is going to benefit farmers and people working the land, rather than unintentionally harming them, you have to understand their context and embrace the web of relationships that binds them to you and you to them. So, we've talked about embracing the web of relationships on the farm and embracing the web of relationships in the food system. And while we emphasize that a resilient agricultural system must be centered around people who work the land, it of course encompasses far more than that. If we are to understand the day-to-day lived experience of people who work the land on our behalf, or truly if we are to understand the day-to-day lived experience of literally anyone, we have to understand their context, where they're coming from, how their experience of the world has differed from our own. And where there's harm being done, or where there's harm that was done in the past that was never repaired, we have to pay attention to that, and we have to work to make it right. If we're talking about agriculture in Alabama, there's literally no getting around the history of enslavement and the immense wealth it created and sustained for a few, while exploiting the labor and denying basic liberties to countless Africans and their descendants. It's estimated that the value of labor extracted from enslaved Africans between 1619 and 1865 is over $97 quadrillion. I literally have no idea how to conceive of how much money that is. $97 quadrillion. For a little bit of scale, the total net worth of the US and everything in it in 2015 was about $87 trillion with a T, which is less than 0.001% of $97 quadrillion. Just let that sink in for a second. And of course, the damage done is far more than just monetary, and neither did the harm end in 1865. Slavery has taken on new shapes, new forms since then. It has evolved. And add to that, new forms of harm, new forms of inequitable distribution of resources have continued to show up. In 1982, black farmers received just 1% of farm ownership loans. The following year, the USDA gave just 109 loans to black farmers, total, throughout the whole country. Because of institutional discrimination within the USDA, white farmers were able to get critical loans to operate and grow their farms, while black farmers' loan applications were torn up and put in the trash. The farmers who were applying for these loans were spit on, they were humiliated, they were spoken down to by USDA agents, reflecting still pervasive racism throughout the South and throughout the nation. And remember, this is the 1980s we're talking about, not that long ago. This isn't just a question of racist individuals doing mean things. The discrimination was systemic, baked in, to a taxpayer-funded department of our government. And the impact of that discrimination continues to reverberate in the food system. In 1997, for example, 400 black farmers won a class action lawsuit that alleged that the USDA had denied them loans based on racial discrimination. The lawsuit is called Pigford versus Glickman. Black farmers, as a result of the lawsuit, were eligible for payments of up to $50,000 to their claims. But for many of them, this was more than 30 years later. Many people had died by then, or their inability to secure the funds they needed at the time meant that they lost their farms. Between 1920 and 2007, black farmers lost 80% of their land. Black families lost land that was maybe in their families for generations, land that not only could have helped them build wealth, but that held personal and cultural and spiritual value. Being displaced from one's land has deep, deep intergenerational spiritual impact. It creates a wound in the web, so to speak, one that must be healed, that we must all work to heal if we want to move forward together. The point here is that if you're looking at things with a focus on the entire web of relationships, your goal is to maximize well-being in the biggest possible sense. In the context of the web, exploitation and extraction and inequity simply don't make sense. Extracting something from one part of the web in such a way that it weakens or disempowers that part in order to enrich another part, it simply doesn't make sense. It causes harm that is ultimately felt by the entire web as a whole. And so we must talk about justice and equity when we talk about sustainability, or else we're not really talking about the whole of sustainability. It may be hard to envision the way forward, but that doesn't mean it's not incumbent upon us to try. So I've talked about embracing the web of relationships on the farm, and embracing the web of relationships in the food system, and embracing the web of relationships in our communities and culture at large. And while these are all talking about embracing our part in a complex web across space, we must also understand how we fit into an even more complex web across time, so generation after generation. I think that we can all agree in theory, and can understand in theory, this idea that wisdom is lost when elders die without being connected to younger generations. And we could acknowledge this, and in theory, value elders and value youth. And yet there are strong cultural forces that keep generations divided, and that give strong preference and power to the adult generation. Folks say between 25 and 60. We can say we want to hold on to the wisdom of the elders, but our culture is not actually set up to do it. Because it's not like the wisdom of the elders can simply be saved by sitting down with someone for 5 minutes and downloading it all. Transmission from one generation to the next has to come within the context of practice and of relationship. And we say we want to value and invest in young people, but again, our culture is not actually set up to make space for young people to lead. In some ways, you could think of it like each generation is one run of the industrial production line, and we're not doing a very good job of connecting the end back to the beginning. We're not being very socially regenerative, if you will. If our food system, if our organizing and our activism don't honor our elders and ancestors, then we are not building on the past, but rather starting building from the ground level all over again. And if we aren't involving youth, then we aren't acknowledging that there might be ways that we could improve, or that the work will continue after we are done. Civil rights icon Angela Davis spoke recently in Birmingham, and I had the privilege to go and hear her. Towards the end, she was asked to reflect about the results of her activism, how she saw things being different today. And in some ways, she deferred answering. She made the point that we are conditioned by the society we live in, by capitalism, to expect a quick result from our activism, to expect a product. When really, she says, you have to do the work to some extent knowing that you won't see the end of it. You have to labor with faith on something collectively much bigger than your individual experience and your individual lifetime. In early 2018, we realized that on an organizational level, ASAN was in some ways perpetuating this dynamic of valuing adults and pushing elders and youth, especially youth, to the side, seeing them as secondary. We took an intentional step to better engage youth with our work. We established a youth council who would meet throughout the year to plan a youth food and farm forum, which would be held alongside our adult food and farm forum, which is ASAN's biggest event of the year and the biggest annual gathering of our network from across the state. Our first youth forum was this past December, and it was really, really amazing. The Food and Farm Forum, and within it, the Youth Forum, are focused a lot on educational and interactive sessions. But to me, the most joyous parts are the meals, the social spaces, the evening times, when people get to just spend open-ended time with each other. The forum is in some ways a conference, but it's also in some ways a retreat or a reunion of sorts. It's at the very end of the growing season. And we intentionally hold it at a camp or some other place where folks can drive and park and unpack and not get in the car again for 2 days. All the meals are served on-site, family style, and we really try to get people out of the formality and the professionalism that conferences often have. We are intentional that we want folks to get comfortable, both in the space and with one another. This is for lots of reasons, but the main reason is that we want to create space that might allow for vulnerability, so that forum participants might not only learn together, but actually grow together. So for many folks, the sessions are seen as the productive part of the program, the real work. But I maintain that these social spaces are equally productive if we think of things in terms of the relationship web and not the production line. Maybe generative might be a better word here. Because it's in these spaces that relationships get built and that we get to dissolve some of these barriers that keep us trapped in our own generational lanes. The first night of the forum, there was this table of folks, pictured here, ranging in age from probably 13 to 70-something, most of whom hadn't met before that day. And they were playing spoons. They're not playing spoons in this picture, but they were playing spoons. Do you guys know the card game Spoons? So you pass cards one at a time around a table, and if you want, you can swap them out with one of the cards in your hand. The goal being to try to make 4 of a kind in your hand. And when someone gets 4 of a kind, they grab a spoon from the middle of the table. At which point, it's essentially like musical chairs, but with spoons. Everybody tries to grab the remaining spoons, but there's one fewer spoon than there are people playing. So somebody comes up empty-handed. And this game, I don't know about y'all, but at least in my circles, this game is notorious for getting raucous. And people are like diving across the table and wrestling each other for the final spoon. I grew up playing spoons with my extended family when we would get all our uncles and aunts and cousins together at our family's cabin. And to be honest, this game of spoons at the forum felt a whole lot like that. And what's really powerful is when you stop to realize how incredibly rare it is to actually find spaces like that. How rare it is to interact socially, even intimately, with generations outside your own. I know for many of y'all, you're here as part of the university in some way, as a student or a faculty member. So y'all may have more interaction across age than most, at least in that one way. But think about, outside the context of your family members, how often you engage with, really have the opportunity to build relationships with, say, people who are in their 70s or 80s, or people who are 10, 11, 12, 13 years old. Probably not often, if I had to guess. And if we aim to build resilient community together, there are going to need to be many, many more strands of the relationship web, cross-cutting generations in this way. Now, I'm not suggesting that spoons is somehow going to repair what's wrong with the world. But I do think that we could learn a lot from paying attention to what created that space, what opened up space for that intergenerational relationship building to begin to sprout, and what it will take to nurture that sprout and get those relationships to take deeper root and to thrive. Ultimately, all of this is about that. How do we first recognize that the web of relationships has a lot to offer us? That interconnectivity has richness beyond what we can even conceive of. And our job is simply to create space for and nurture those interactions and interconnections. How do we flex our collective creativity and become masters of unwaste? How do we create the types of communities that wring every bit of use out of what we have, find a use for everything, even if it is as waste to feed the next cycle? To borrow from the soil organic matter example, How do we create the spongiest community network that we possibly can? How do we tie together as many loops as possible on a grand scale and across generations? One way of differentiating sustainable agriculture from what is known as conventional agriculture is that conventional agriculture tries to feed the plant, while sustainable agriculture tries to feed the soil. And by that I mean, if you see the soil as simply a backdrop or a lifeless medium in which your cash crop is growing, then to provide for the needs of the plant, you're going to have to add fertilizers and so on. You're going to have to feed the plant. The soil in this equation is somewhat invisible. Where if you're seeing the soil as the intermediary, as the site where the real magic is happening, then you focus first on creating and feeding a healthy soil, and you take that leap of faith that it will in turn feed the plant. And we found that this approach, even if it might seem a little bit counterintuitive or a little indirect, actually works better. I would argue that on a larger scale, when your focus is on feeding individuals, meeting the needs of individuals only, you ultimately create a very weak and ultimately doomed system. When you shift your focus and seek to feed community, feed that web of relationships, human and non, that holds everything else in place, then the humans in that community are better off, as is everything else. So what I hope that y'all will take away from this talk is that interconnectedness is something to be cherished, something to feed and be fed from, something sacred. And while focus is good and specialization is valuable, they are only as valuable as the context and the fabric that holds them. If we are serious about building a resilient agricultural system, both in Alabama and in the world, then we must focus on relationships. Thank you. And I think we've got time for a few questions. So I don't know if folks have questions. This is my contact information. I've also put a couple of key pieces of information below that. So feel free to reach out to me afterwards also. But if you've got questions now, happy to take them. Yes, Dr. Webb.
When you work across Alabama, then what would you call the biggest challenges that you face in your position?
In my position, or what challenge do I see other people facing? Whew. Yeah, that's a great question. So the question was, as we do our work across Alabama, what challenges do I face in my position, and what challenges do the people that we work with face? I mean, honestly, I think, I grew up in Huntsville, and I think had this sense that like, oh yeah, like Alabama, check, like I know that place. And it wasn't until I started working for ASAN that I became keenly aware of like how big of a state Alabama is. Like it's really large. And I think that, in some ways, talking about building communities of relationships and sort of building deep intimacy is almost impossible on a statewide level. Like it has to be that there are communities that have those types of like deep, intimate relationships in their own local place, and then they're connected to each other to form a statewide network. So I think in some ways the challenges are in being an organization that, we have a staff of 2 full-time people and 1 part-time person, and that's a fairly new development. For a long time, we only had 1 person for the whole state, which really just, isn't tenable. I think we could stand to have 100 people covering the whole state and still sort of wouldn't have the level of sort of depth working with the people that we work with. So I think there's a little bit of tension that you have to hold in that way of, I spend a lot of time on the highway driving by at 70 miles an hour, and you just don't build intimacy with with communities in that way. So kind of seeing that travel and seeing it as a means to an end, and know that sort of our trajectory is to like build from the bottom up and try to really sort of empower the folks that we work with and build skills that they need to sort of do the work themselves, and that we are really more just like the connective entity. So yeah, I mean, I think the more concrete version of that answer is I think our challenges are with like staff capacity. Like I wish there are a million things that I would love for us to be able to do that I think would meet needs that have been expressed to us, but we just, there's only so much that 2.5 people can do in the week. And I think as far as what challenges that people we work with, I mean, I guess specifically farmers that we work with face, some of it depends on the region. I think there's different challenges depending on where farmers are. But I think in general, sort of speaking to an audience of mostly non-farmers, I mean, I think one of the big challenges is just like having support from consumers. And I think, knowing that there's demand for the products they're selling, and, getting folks to go to farmers markets, getting folks to, subscribe to CSAs. I think in some ways our society, I mean, I kind of alluded to this a little bit, but I think our society, like the infrastructure of our society, makes it really hard sometimes to support local food. People are used to be able to go to the grocery store any time of the day or night, and when suddenly like a farmer's market is for 3 hours on one day, I certainly know that sometimes that's hard for me. And so I think there's a challenge to us working in the movement of how can we sort of use creative juices to meet people where they are. But I think there's also value in kind of looking at what are those like structural barriers that are making it really hard for people to support the things they want to be supporting, and sort of picking that apart a little bit. So hopefully that answered your question, Dr. Webb. Yeah.
I had a presentation given by an IFBC member earlier this year, and the presentation said that in 2050, the world population is probably going to double.
Mm-hmm.
And furthermore, the world is going to be required to raise enough food on the arable land that we have now, and have, it basically double also. So my question to you is your organization doing anything to address this problem? And if so, what is it?
Yeah, so the question was, and tell me if I sort of summarize this correctly, that basically by 2050, it's anticipated, yeah, sometime soon, terrifyingly soon, the world's population will essentially double. And so the hypothesis is that we need, given sort of the amount of arable land we have in the world today, the productivity of that land will also need to double in order to feed those people. And sort of what is ASEAN doing about that? Is that, yeah?
Are they doing anything in so way?
Yeah, cool. So I think there's a couple of parts to what I want to say, and I'm going to try to hold them all in my brain while I say them. I think one of them is that I think that the language is tricky here. I think the language around sort of feeding the world has in some ways been co-opted, I think, by sort of industrial agriculture. That sort of the imperative for us to sort of resort to industrial methods and, maximize production now, it's like this crisis moment, right? Like, it's like, how will we feed the world? Like, this is, do you want people to starve? Obviously, no. And so it's sort of seen as sort of the ends justifying the means. When I think that, number one, like, there's already enough food in the world to feed the world. It's a distribution problem. And really, I think when you talk about distribution problem, it's really like a poverty and like wealth inequity problem. So I think we could solve that problem now if we had sort of the political will. I don't think it's about whether the land can produce enough food or not. And I think the other piece is that, like, what's not being factored into that equation is that industrial agriculture creates less arable land, like it desertifies. Is that the right word? I'm looking to my mom, who's a biology teacher. Like desertification happens in part because of industrial agriculture. And so actually the amount of arable land is not this fixed number. We're getting less and less arable land because of what we're doing to sort of the ecology of local places and sort of climate change on a grand scale. And so I think there have actually been a lot of studies that, like the UN, I mean, big names, people doing studies that have said that actually like organic agriculture, sort of very like labor intensive, but very like sort of resource not intensive agriculture ultimately produces better than industrial agriculture if you look at it in sort of a grand scale and across time. Like you may not get that sort of quick bang, but if you're cultivating a really healthy soil ecosystem, it actually does produce better and longer over time, and like better when faced with sort of the unexpected changes in climate and other things that we might face in the next 50 years. So, you know, I guess I say that to say that ASAN is not necessarily specifically tackling that, but I think that all the farmers in our network are to some extent, you know, farming organically. That can be big O organic or little o organic, or sustainably, or using permaculture, you know, all these sort of different methods that are intending to do sort of what I was talking about, like sort of repairing this like ecosystem, which I think ultimately does actually, like, it feeds maybe its immediate community, but if you think about like farms like that and food systems like that being everywhere across the world, then that is feeding the world, even though you're not, as one farmer, shipping your stuff to China or to wherever. You're not personally feeding the world, but you are feeding your one little intimate corner of the world. So I think, yeah, it's sort of about a framework shift, and I think that the farmers that we work with, you know, I think get that and are seeking mostly to feed other Alabamians. And so it's a really sort of short supply chain. They're loading up their stuff and driving to the farmer's market like an hour away. So, yeah. One more question?
I have two quick questions.
Okay, 2 more questions then. Mm-hmm.
And vermiculture, as he explained it, is very renewable. It's not the same as chemical, you know, artificial fertilizers. But he stressed it had very important role in their role for developing nations as far as being used to feed the soil and have very good results with growing crops for food.
Mm-hmm.
My second question too is, I know that Alabama now about 300 farmers are using hemp programs, probably intended to grow industrial hemp in Alabama. And is your organization, I know about it, are you all involved in hemp?
Excellent. So tell me, I didn't quite hear the question in your first, I know you were talking about vermiculture. Do you have a specific question about it, or just sort of wanted to know if we're doing things with it? Mm-hmm.
Stations in local communities where they are cultivating earthworm production and vermiculture.
Mm-hmm.
Is that something we see being used very much in developing countries at all, or even in Alabama?
Mm-hmm. Cool. Okay, so I'm going to repeat those. The first question was sort of about vermiculture, which is like worm composting. And I only know very little about vermiculture, so if any of y'all are like vermiculturists, feel free to speak up. But yeah, I mean, I think to your question, like definitely a useful way of producing really rich compost, as well as like people make worm tea which can kind of be used as fertilizer and sort of pest management. And my understanding is that, I mean, you could have a worm composter like in your kitchen. So I think it's a really approachable way to do composting. Like it's faster, I think, and you can do it in a smaller space than a regular compost pile. So, you know, for y'all that are college students, something to think about, maybe a like dorm hall worm composting bin. But yeah, I mean, I think, you know, there's nothing synthetic about that. It's like worms are digesting your food waste and turning it into their, you know, worm manure, essentially, which is really rich stuff. So very pro vermiculture, I guess. And your second question was about hemp production, which has, and I don't know all the exact specific details. We've sort of been tracking the overall movement for this in Alabama in the recent years. So it sort of got legalized to have research done on it, and then just recently they were sort of awarding permits to farmers to grow hemp. And so hemp is related to, but not actually that similar to marijuana as a plant. And hemp is really interesting, actually, and I don't know all the history like by heart, but you should look up, like there's a lot of stuff on the internet about hemp and how like the first money was printed on hemp paper. Like it's like at the core of like our country's history, but sort of got like blacklisted at some point because of its relatedness to marijuana, and like was a controlled plant, like people legally couldn't grow it. But it can be used for fiber, it can be used for seed, like hemp seed and hemp seed oil is like a sort of health food thing. It can be used for like industrial uses, like people build things out of hempcrete, which is like concrete made of hemp. And it can grow like, compared to something like cotton, which really decimates the soil, it can grow in like pretty marginal soils and like on hillsides and stuff without a whole lot of damage. So it's actually like got a huge potential. And I would say Colorado and Kentucky are the states that are sort of like doing the best at it so far. They really like got out in front and like sort of created the like regulatory channels to get seeds and farmers producing it. So that's sort of a slowly unrolling thing in Alabama that I don't think there's anybody growing it just yet, but it like holds a lot of potential, and definitely would like encourage y'all to sort of keep an eye on it as sort of a way to produce fiber and a whole lot of other things in a somewhat, you know, with a smaller kind of ecological footprint. Yeah.
300 farmers have signed up in different states to plant this
Cool. Okay. Yeah. Yeah, I think they did the permitting like just recently in the past month or two, so cool. Dr. Webb, are we out of time?
Thank you, Alex.
Okay, thank you all so much.